Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. Have you ever traveled through the city of Philadelphia, or maybe even South Jersey, or the suburbs for that matter, and you stumbled upon a home, an estate, or maybe even in a mansion, and you wondered, who lives behind those gates? What's so special about this property? And perhaps maybe even ponder the historical significance of that home. Well, in our area, we are really fortunate enough to have homes that date back to the early years of our country. Sometimes we know the history of that building, like in the case of Independence Hall. Some cases we think we know the history of that home, and unfortunately, oftentimes people just pass by as if the building didn't even exist. Well, behind each and every one of those front doors, there's a story of how Strawberry Mansion got its name. Yeah, we think of Strawberry Mansion as a section of the city of Philadelphia, but there is really a Strawberry Mansion. Or how about that Spanish colonial revival house, La Ronda? Today, we look at these homes as relics of the past, but really, they're snapshots of our history. I'm glad to welcome back to the Philly Factor author Thom Nickels. Thom has documented the stories behind these homes and mansions in his new book, Philadelphia Mansions, Stories and Characters Behind the Walls. Thom, welcome back to the program.
Hello, Paul. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I think you and knowing you and having you on the show a few times before and knowing a little bit about your backstory and your history, you probably appreciate more than anybody else, going past a home that may be shuttered, may have some type of demolition sticker on the front door because it has just fallen into state of repair, but the stories behind that front door. And you've documented some of them so well in your new book. What made you decide to focus on Philadelphia mansions?
It's a good question. I originally wanted to do a book on Locke, Eyrie, which is in Fraser, Chester County.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an old Victorian blue limestone house built in 1865 in Fraser, and I lived maybe not even a half mile from the estate. And as a kid, 9, 10, 11, I would go up with friends and we would hang out in the backyard where there was this great pond and a large white statue of Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really a page out of the past. It was something out of Grimm's fairy tales. And in a child's eye, it was so mysterious and fascinating. Mm. A far cry from the split level houses that we lived in just a half mile away.
Yeah.
So that was the original idea, to do a book on Locke, Eyrie. My publishers thought that I should expand the idea and just do a general book on mansions in the Philadelphia area.
Mm. I started out the program by saying, the Strawberry Mansion section of the city. Most people know Strawberry Mansion as a neighborhood. They think of that neighborhood in North Philadelphia, if you will, but they may not realize that there really is a Strawberry Mansion.
There's a lot of confusion around the phrasing Strawberry Mansion. And when I was doing the book for the first time, I realized that you don't call the house Strawberry Mansion, you call it Historic Strawberry Mansion. And that is the framework in which the house exists.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who lived there? I mean, why is this home so historic? I mean, why is it so significant in the history of Philadelphia?
Well, it's extremely old, and a man named Judge Lewis lived there. And I think I go into detail about how eccentric he was. He used to live his cigarette butts all around the place. And Strawberry Mansion became, for a long time, you said that houses that are gutted up and boarded up have a suspect history. And certainly the house was known for a while. It was an inn, for instance. It was a restaurant, and it's believed that Henry James dined there. The upper floors, it was rumored, and I think the rumors are pretty substantial, it was kind of a sailor's rendezvous house. Mm. So Strawberry Mansion has a pretty checkered history.
Yeah. Now, who is in control of, who owns, who runs Strawberry Mansion? I think I know the answer to this question, but here's a building in a part of town that probably is not getting a lot of foot traffic from visitors, but yet is not necessarily in disrepair or ruin or facing a date with the wrecking ball.
No, it was one of those lucky houses, one of the Fairmount Park houses that received a lot of money from the city. So I think all of those Fairmount Park houses are pretty safe from the wrecking ball. It's the houses that are like islands in the sea of other lesser houses are the ones that are in danger. The vast estates on the main line, such as La Ronda that you mentioned,
Right.
and possibly Ardrosian, and possibly Woodmont now with the death of Mother Divine. She died just about a year ago. So these vast estates are too expensive to maintain, and if they can't be broken up into condos, apartments, law firms, or medical offices, then I guess a worst case scenario is that they have to be demolished.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes unfortunate, because this snapshot of history, all that's left is really a photograph or two or three or maybe 3 dozen of these buildings, and maybe some type of historical account like you've documented in your book that shows who lived there and why these buildings were so significant. Yeah.
I think one of the more interesting houses in Center City that I researched was the Lippincott Mansion, which is at about 20-something Locust Street. That was purchased by Joshua Lippincott, who was the founder of Lippincott Publishing. And they were a Society of Friends publisher, and they published Bibles. At the turn of the 20th century, they switched to more secular fare. And so they had 2 interesting children. Christina Lippincott,
Right.
who was a suffragette. She was married for a while. It is said that she was a friend of Dora Lewis, who came from another significant Philadelphia family, who was the first woman to go on a hunger strike in the name of the suffragette movement. But Christina was wildly eccentric. When she became a feminist, she divorced her husband, and she started to hold meetings in the house. And it was said that no good woman ever enters this house. And it was really quite a scandal at the time.
Wow. There are some, I guess a lot of people may be thrown by the word mansion because, look, there are many homes, whether it's Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, wherever you go, there are homes. But when people hear the term mansion, they automatically put it into an upper class, upper scale, elite type of society. When we use the term mansion, is that synonymous with high society in Philadelphia?
Well, that is the first thing that comes to mind, but of course, I like to approach the idea of mansions from a more expansive view. There's that old scriptural quote, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," although I hear that the real interpretation is that in my Father's house there are many houses. So there you have an interchange between mansions and houses. I play on the concept of what a mansion is. For instance, in the book I have the Mormon Temple as a mansion, the Barnes Museum as a mansion, even the Walt Whitman House in Camden as a mansion. And I even go in to the concept of mansions in the afterlife. This is a very unorthodox book where I quote Swedenborg of the Swedenborg Church, the Swedish mystic, who claims to have been taken up into heaven by an angel. And there, he says, there are many different kinds of neighborhoods and houses, and you get basically what you've earned in life. So if you've led a mediocre, kind of suspect, amoral life, you're going to go into a dowdy afterlife neighborhood. So I loved these kind of comparisons and kind of matching it up with real life houses in the city.
You mentioned the Walt Whitman House.
I did.
Been to the Walt Whitman House, and I know you're also, one of your areas of expertise is on the topic of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman's home in Camden would not personify or typify a mansion. I mean, it's a pretty humble home right there, and I could see the home. I don't know what street it's on. I want to say Cooper Street, but I'm probably wrong. But it doesn't necessarily fit the description of mansion.
No, but it was a poetic powerhouse. And when you use that phraseology, then you see the house quite differently. It is revered and venerated like a mansion, though. And this is what is really fascinating. When you see people walk through the Walt Whitman house, they could be people on pilgrimage. They could be people walking through a great French cathedral with the relics of a saint here and there, etc. So that it's that kind of a feeling.
Yeah. In your research for this book, was there? I mean, I'm sure there are many stories that popped out at you, but any one story that was that aha moment, like you learned something that perhaps you didn't know before about a property or the people that lived in that property?
I was fascinated when I was researching Locke Eyrie in Fraser, and my research led me to stories concerning tramps and vagabonds after the Civil War. They would travel the countryside in fairly large groups. They didn't have jobs. For the most part, they were former Civil War soldiers. And they were much like the homeless today with their signs in front of Wawa and 7-Eleven. And a lot of them turned to thievery in order to eat. And Locke Eyrie had a major problem with tramps and vagabonds trying to get into the house. And William E. Lockwood, who owned the house and who built the house in 1865, Addison Hutton was the architect, he had an alarm system, one of the I think the earliest alarm systems that would just alert him to people on his property.
Wow.
So that's a story that I found fascinating.
Yeah. We should mention here that your background and perhaps your passion about these mansions goes back to your childhood because your grandfather was an architect, right?
Yes, he was,
Yeah.
Frank V. Nichols.
And he had not just a close encounter, but an encounter with one Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes,
Yeah.
of all people.
Yeah.
My grandfather was commissioned by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia to try to get the land rights for Nazareth Hospital. Now, he had designed a lot of churches and parochial schools and townhouses in Center City and places on Lombard Street. So his job was to meet with Howard Hughes, with my then grandmother, Pauline Clavey, and they probably met him, I don't know all of the details, but they probably went to the Northeast Airport where he flew in on his own plane because he did have his own plane.
Sure.
And at that point, he was the quintessential Hollywood playboy. I mean, he was, all the women were madly in love with him. He was having concurrent affairs. His thing was to have affairs with women, then to stop the affair, but never to forget them, but always to send them monthly checks so they could pay their rent. So he had this do-good thing, you know, I'm not going to leave them stranded. But my father and my grandfather and my grandmother met Howard Hughes at the airport, and they somehow got him back to my grandfather's house in Lansdowne on Albemarle Avenue. And that's where Howard Hughes reviewed the plans for Nazareth Hospital. So he saw the blueprints, and it was probably in the dining room or somewhere. And he was so impressed that he told my grandfather, I'm not going to charge the Archdiocese for this. It's just take it. No charge.
Wow.
So he donated the land. And anyway, my grandfather didn't talk about this too much. I guess he was a fairly humble man in retrospect. I always thought he was quite pompous. But I would have thought that he would have mentioned Howard Hughes' name a lot more than he did.
Yeah. And you had an encounter with a bicyclist on a street corner who was looking for you and wanted to connect with you because he is now living in the house that your grandfather built where this meeting would have occurred?
Yes. Anthony, and I can't pronounce his last Italian name, so I feel kind of embarrassed about that. But he's the son of the mayor of Lansdowne.
Okay.
And it's called the mayor's mansion. So when I heard this, I thought, well, the townspeople of Lansdowne are already calling it a mansion, so I have a pass to sort of write about it. So it became my architect and Howard Hughes, because in fact, my grandfather is my architect.
Yeah. I also want to talk here because we've talked about homes where people lived, and some of those homes that are still with us now, and some of those homes that have either been destroyed or on the cusp of being destroyed by wrecking balls. But there's also been this movement in the city where many houses of worship, some might consider, mansions, given the description you gave us at the early part of the program. But many of these churches now are facing, no light at the end of the tunnel, because many of them are in disrepair. They've become wayward stops for a whole variety of people. And, there are preservation efforts that are underway to try to save these historic structures, but in many cases, the end doesn't look good because of the amount of money that would have to go into these churches to fix them up in order to be structurally integral.
Yes, and I do go into that quite a bit. I do talk about the Elstow Mansion in Elkins Park, which later became the Dominican Retreat House. And of course, in the 50s and 60s, and I think early 70s, retreats were very, very popular among young Catholic girls, and it was primarily a retreat place for younger women. But after Vatican II, that kind of fell off, and retreats fell out of fashion. But when I toured the Elstow Mansion, I was amazed to find old confessionals where the chapel was. And these are old wooden confessionals, and one door says priest and the other door says penitent. And it's very, very fascinating. And then, of course, there's the old Poor Clare Convent on North Girard Avenue, right near Broad Street, which was a famous convent since the 20s, with a huge stone wall all around it. And the nuns there found that impossible to maintain after a while, so they had to move the convent. Of course, the new convent looked nothing like the old convent in terms of interior architecture. Now, I've always had a problem with Catholic Church architecture since Vatican II. I don't like a lot of modern Catholic churches. They're too sparse. They have a very, very Protestant look, very, very plain. And in some instances, you don't even know whether they're even Catholic. You'd be scratching your head.
Yeah.
So, but in any event, they did manage to take one glass stained window from the old convent on Girard Avenue.
Yeah. The Cardinals Home or
Yeah.
Cardinals Mansion on City Avenue, as depending on just how Catholic you are, if it's a home or a mansion, but some people would say, some people would say, and even goes to the whole case of, the Poor Clare Monastery. A lot of people would argue, did they really need to live in, the mission, of, the religious life was, sort of to do God's will, but did they really have to be so full of, all of, look, all you have to do is go to the Vatican, library, and you see all the wealth that is stored away in the basement of the Vatican. So where I'm getting with this is, we had this home where the Cardinals would live, I think going back to Archbishop Doherty, or probably...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So now it's part of St. Joseph's University.
That's true.
Yeah.
Cardinals were once called princes of the church. I think that term has been denuded somewhat. But when you're a prince, where else do you live but in a mansion? Where does Prince Harry live? He doesn't live in a split-level home. He doesn't live in a townhouse in Fishtown. But he lives in a grandiose kind of structure. So, but I think that people have a right to sort of criticize personal living styles for clergy. But they often get that confused with the gold and the so-called ostentation that is used for the actual place of worship. I think there's a big difference. You don't have to live like a prince, but if you're purporting to build something for the glory of God, you're not going to build a hovel. And it's, you know, much the same way that the original temple in Jerusalem was built, where Jesus worshiped. That original temple was filled with gold and what some might consider grandiose ostentation. Not necessary.
Yeah.
But Jesus never said a word about it.
He only threw them out of the
Interesting.
temple
When they were desecrating
Yeah.
it with the sails,
Yep.
the tables.
Again, the name of the book is, and if you are a history buff or not, or you just like books about Philadelphia, it's called Philadelphia Mansions, Stories and Characters Behind the Walls. It is by Thom Nickels, and that gives you a cover of the, what's on the cover of the book here? What
This is the Elstow Mansion, which later became the Dominican Retreat House.
Okay, all right.
In fact, all of the photographs on the book are from those grounds.
Yeah. What is it you hope, Tom, people take away when they pick up this book? I mean, it's not just a history book. It really is a step back in time to learn the backstory behind the people that lived behind these gates. So what do you hope people take away from the book?
It's a combination of history and contemporary history. I go in, for instance, to opening day at the Barnes Foundation, and I quote speakers from that time. So it's really a grand epic on mansions and buildings and the people involved in their construction, demise, and the people who live there. And it includes every topic from religion to the most secular thing that you could imagine.
But you also document in your book, and there was a lot of controversy over the excavation down in Old City at 6th and Market, where they discovered the president's house. And while you know, they're the remnants of what's left of the of the president's house, and while we don't necessarily look at it as a mansion, it was, they say, the first White House where President Washington and Jefferson, I believe, sort of sat as presidents of the United States. But again, we continue to learn more about what went on at the president's house besides it just being the official home for the President of the United States.
I was very, very disappointed when I saw the design myself. The New York Times gave the president's house a very bad review. And, you know, I consider it a house or a design built by severe political correctness, because everybody knows that Washington and Jefferson had slaves. We all know that slavery was wrong. However, when you build something called the President's House, we don't need third grade style instructions on the evils of slavery. And this is what the President's House has become. You know, over and over and over again, you're reminded just how evil slavery was. It's just the wrong approach.
Do you think there would come a time when they might reconsider the design or might reconsider the project to either expand the storyline or change the storyline? Look, as you said, what went on there was wrong. That's a given. But perhaps bring it, you know, maybe turn the corner, turn the page, and maybe change the storyline there.
Yeah, I don't know. Not for a while, because we're in the thick of a very PC culture, and I don't think that stone is going to be moved for a while. Certainly, if you want to build a museum to slavery, fine. But if you want to build a president's house, don't mix the two topics. You know, it becomes confusing, and it doesn't tell the story of the original White House. It tells one side of the story. But I think it's going to be a while before that happens.
Yeah, downtown Philadelphia, you know, you go down Walnut Street, and many of the brownstones that were there have been replaced by, you name the store today. But yet, when you go to Rittenhouse Square, you know, some of those buildings exist from that bygone era, but I suspect most people walk by those buildings on a daily basis and have no idea what's really on the other side of the front door.
That's true. I used to pass Henry McElhenney's mansion all the time when I was a journalism student, not knowing that inside there were parties where Tennessee Williams attended and Andy Warhol and Princess Margaret and everything. Who would have known from the very sedate exterior? By the same token, where the Barclay Hotel is, that was the site of the son of Joshua Lippincott, Craig Lippincott, who committed suicide in 1911. It was a front page item in the New York Times. Lippincott heir shoots self, you know. He was found with a gun beside him. So, of course, the family tried to cover that up because nobody likes to talk about suicide.
Right, right.
You know.
Yeah.
But there are a million stories in the naked city, as they say.
For sure. And you could read some of them in the new book by Thom Nickels, Philadelphia's Mansion, Stories and Characters Behind the Walls. You've done a wonderful job with this, this book. And thanks so much for coming in and talking to us about your book.
Thank you, Paul, very much.
Thom Nickels, our guest, and I want to thank you for tuning in and watching this edition of The Philly Factor. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perrello. Thanks for being with us. And they do the cutaway shot. Good job. Half hour.